A desperate father crosses the border into cartel territory to rescue his kidnapped daughter. But as he faces ruthless enemies and uncovers dark secrets, he realizes the real fight isn't just for her life. It's for their survival. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, spilling gold and crimson across the winding roads of southern Texas. Emma Turner sat in the back seat of her father's old SUV, flanked by her two best friends, Sarah and Ben. The summer trip had been her idea, a spontaneous adventure before they all started college. "Turn left," Sarah said, pointing excitedly to an unmarked dirt road snaking away from the main highway. Ben raised an eyebrow. "You sure that's the shortcut? Looks sketchy?" Emma laughed, tugging at the sleeves of her denim jacket. "Relax. GPS says it shaves 20 minutes off. It'll be fine." The road narrowed quickly, bumping and jolting the SUV as it carved through empty fields and sparse brush. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The cheerful banter slowly faded to silence as the familiar landmarks disappeared. Emma squinted at the map on her phone. "Okay, this is weird. It says we should have hit the main road again by now." Ben leaned forward, frowning. "Wait, Emma, look, is that a fence?" Ahead, a rusted chain-link barrier stretched across the road. A weathered sign hung crookedly on its post. "Frontera, prohibido el paso." "What does that mean?" Sarah whispered, nerves creeping into her voice. Emma's stomach dropped. "It's the border. We took the wrong turn." Before they could reverse, two black pickup trucks rumbled out from the brush, their engines growling like predators ready to pounce. Armed men in camouflage vests spilled from the trucks, their faces obscured by bandanas. "Stay in the car," Emma hissed, panic thick in her throat. The armed men moved fast, their boots crunching on the gravel as they surrounded the SUV. One of them, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes, approached the driver's window. He tapped the glass with the muzzle of his rifle. Ben's hands shook as he lowered the window. The man's voice was low and dangerous. "Get out!" When they hesitated, he barked again, louder this time. "Out! Now!" The three scrambled out of the vehicle, hands raised. Emma felt her heart hammering as the man's gaze scanned them like prey. "Americans," he muttered in Spanish to another man who laughed harshly. "Lost little lambs." A sharp metallic click echoed as one of the men cocked his weapon. Emma's breathing faltered. Her phone vibrated silently in her pocket, but she didn't dare reach for it. The leader tilted his head, a cruel smile curling behind the bandana. "Take them." Hundreds of miles away, Jake Turner sat alone at his cluttered kitchen table, nursing a glass of whiskey. The dim light reflected off framed photos of his daughter scattered across the room. Emma at her high school graduation, Emma blowing out birthday candles, Emma laughing in the summer sun. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the unknown number, a frown creasing his brow before he answered. "Mr. Turner?" The voice was deep, accented. A chill ran down Jake's spine. "Yes, who is this?" "Your daughter. She made a mistake." Jake shot upright in his chair. "What are you talking about? Who is this? Where's Emma?" A beat of silence passed, then an image arrived via text. Jake's heart stopped. It was Emma, kneeling on a dirt floor, flanked by masked men. Her wide eyes were red and terrified. "If you want her back alive," the voice continued calmly, "you'll listen carefully. No police, no tricks. We will contact you again." The call ended. Jake stared at the phone, his breath ragged and uneven. He hit redial, but the line was dead. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, no, no." His first instinct was to call the police. Within minutes, a local officer arrived at the house, his expression professional but detached, as Jake showed him the image. "Sir, these situations are complicated," the officer said, his tone hesitant. "The border complicates jurisdiction. You should wait for—" "Wait?" Jake snapped, his fury rising. "They have my daughter. I'm not going to just sit here." The officer offered little comfort. Calls to federal agencies were met with the same bureaucratic response. Endless red tape, indifferent apologies, and promises of action that rang hollow. Jake sank onto his couch, clutching the phone in his hands as tears stung his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this helpless. The hours dragged on like a living nightmare until, finally, another text buzzed through. This time it was a short video. Emma's voice shook as she spoke. "Dad, they said they'll kill me if you don't do what they say, please." The video cut off. Jake's resolve hardened like steel. He knew what had to be done. No more waiting, no more relying on a broken system. If no one else would fight for Emma, he would. He opened the dusty garage, grabbed an old duffel bag and began pulling out supplies, tools of a past he thought he'd left behind. His hands moved with grim purpose. They picked the wrong family, Jake muttered to himself. As dawn approached, he loaded the bag into his truck and took one last look at Emma's photo. His mind was clear now, his mission undeniable. The morning sun burned against the horizon as Jake Turner drove south, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, an empty road that seemed to mirror his isolation. Calls to the FBI and local authorities had been useless. Each agency passed him to the next, their voices cold and detached. They saw Emma as a statistic, not a daughter. "They're just kids," Jake had argued to the Border Patrol agent, shoving the photo of Emma into his face. "They got lost." "Sir, I understand your frustration," the agent replied, avoiding Jake's gaze. "But crossing into cartel territory, it's dangerous. You should stay put and let us handle it." But no one was handling it. Hours slipped by, and the longer they waited, the worse it would get. Cartels didn't deal in compassion. Emma had already been gone for too long. Jake gritted his teeth as he replayed her shaking voice from the video. "Dad, they said they'll kill me if you don't." The truck roared as he pressed the gas harder. The decision was made. He was crossing the border, alone. At the edge of Texas, Jake parked near a dusty lot filled with abandoned cars and forgotten debris. In the distance, the Rio Grande shimmered faintly under the rising heat. He reached into the duffel bag beside him and pulled out an old handgun, checking the magazine before slipping it into his waistband. His hands were steady now, no longer trembling like they had been in the kitchen. His phone buzzed, another message. He froze. It was another photo. Emma, bound to a chair in a dimly lit room. Her head hung low, her hair masking her face. A shadowy figure stood behind her, his hand resting cruelly on her shoulder. Jake's breath hitched, his vision narrowing as fury surged through him. He texted back, "I'm coming for her." His heart pounded as he stared at the phone, waiting, praying for some response. There was none. He was being toyed with. Jake got out of the truck and looked across the border, where scrubland stretched into Mexico. His eyes hardened. "You're not gonna win," he whispered to no one but the wind. The border crossing wasn't guarded, at least not visibly. Years of neglect had turned it into a backdoor for smugglers, traffickers, and desperate souls. Jake slipped through the brush, his boots crunching quietly on the dry earth, every step pulling him further from safety and deeper into uncertainty. He thought of Emma as a little girl, climbing trees in their backyard, her laughter echoing like music. He thought of how proud she had been when she aced her college admission exams, beaming up at him from across the kitchen table. "We're a team, Dad," she'd said, nudging him playfully. "Just us against the world." The memory brought an ache to his chest, but it fueled him too. He wasn't going to let her down. Hours passed as Jake ventured deeper into Mexican territory. He kept to the less traveled paths, ducking beneath fences and avoiding headlights of passing trucks. The air was thick with tension, even in the empty countryside. It felt as though he was being watched, even when no one was there. A sudden noise startled him, a car engine growling in the distance. Jake slipped behind a pile of rusted barrels just in time to see a black SUV speed past, its tinted windows glinting in the sun. "Cartel," Jake muttered, his pulse quickening. He knew the danger was real now, far beyond what any warning had described. This was their territory, their rules. If they found him, they wouldn't hesitate. But Emma was out there, waiting. Jake pushed forward, sweat beading on his brow as the oppressive heat beat down. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of a small town, a collection of low buildings and shacks. His instincts told him to start there. As he approached, a voice rang out from behind him. "Are you lost, amigo?" Jake spun, hand instinctively reaching for his waistband. A man stood under the shadow of an old oak tree, dressed in worn clothes and holding a camera bag slung across his shoulder. His dark eyes studied Jake with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Who are you?" Jake asked, voice low. The man tilted his head. "The better question is, who are you? Americans don't come this far south unless they're looking for trouble." "I'm looking for my daughter," Jake snapped. "The cartel took her." The man's face darkened. "The cartel owns this place. You won't get far alone." Jake hesitated. "I'll get further with help." The stranger studied him for a long moment before sighing. "I'm Raul. I'm a journalist." He gestured toward the town. "Come with me, gringo. I'll tell you what you need to know." Jake didn't trust him, but he didn't have a choice. He fell into step beside Raul, his every muscle coiled with tension. He was one step closer to Emma, but also one step deeper into a world where survival was anything but guaranteed. The town of Santa Cruz was a far cry from the bustling cities Jake had known. Dust clung to every surface, the cracked windows, the crumbling facades, and the old signs swaying with the wind. It was quiet, unsettlingly so, as if the very air held its breath in fear of the cartel's watchful eyes. Raul led Jake through a narrow alley, his steps confident despite the tension pressing down on them. "This place is like a shadow," Raul muttered. "The cartel runs everything. Business, police, even the churches. People here see everything, but they say nothing." Jake scanned their surroundings. Faces peeked cautiously from behind curtains and half-open doors. They disappeared just as quickly. The silence made his skin crawl. "So what's your angle?" Jake asked. His voice was low but sharp. Raul smirked without looking back. "I want the truth. Stories like this, Americans taken by the cartel, never get told. The world ignores this place, but the blood keeps flowing." "And you think I care about headlines?" Jake shot back. Raul stopped abruptly, turning to face him. His dark eyes burned with intensity. "No, but I care about surviving. You're a fool for coming here alone." Jake's jaw tightened. "I'll take my chances." Raul sighed, shaking his head. "Then you'll need help." They arrived at a small, weathered cantina near the town square. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and whispers. Men sat hunched over tables, playing cards or nursing cheap drinks. The bartender glanced up, his gaze lingering on Jake for a moment too long. "Keep your head down," Raul murmured as they settled at a corner table. Jake's hand instinctively hovered near the gun tucked into his waistband. Every instinct screamed that he was out of place, an intruder in a world where outsiders didn't last long. "Listen," Raul said, leaning closer. "I've been tracking the cartel's movements for months. They move their prisoners from place to place, usually to keep the federales guessing. I might know where they're holding your daughter." Jake's heart thumped hard in his chest. "Where?" "Not so fast." Raul held up a hand. "The place I'm thinking of isn't easy to reach. It's an old ranch up in the hills, a stronghold. If they're keeping her there, you won't get her out without a fight." Jake's gaze hardened. "I didn't come here for a negotiation. Just tell me what you know." Raul shook his head, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "You're stubborn. Fine. But you need to understand something. These men don't play games. If you go in without a plan, you're dead." Before Jake could respond, the door creaked open. A group of men entered, their boots heavy against the wooden floor. They wore the unmistakable insignia of the cartel on their jackets, a snake coiled around a skull. Raul cursed under his breath. "We need to leave, now." Jake followed Raul's lead as they slipped out through the back door, emerging into an alley shrouded in shadow. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears as he glanced back, catching sight of one of the cartel men peering into the cantina, scanning the room. "They'll notice you soon," Raul muttered. "You've got maybe a day before word spreads that you're here." Jake met his gaze, determination burning in his eyes. "Then we'll move fast." Raul paused, studying him for a long moment. "For your daughter, huh?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, for Emma." Raul sighed, shaking his head as they disappeared into the maze of alleys. "You'd better be ready, gringo. The wolves are watching." The moon hung low over the hills, its pale light casting long shadows across the dusty ground. Jake crouched beside a crumbling wall, his breathing slow and controlled as he peered through the broken bricks. Ahead, the cartel's operation buzzed with quiet activity. Trucks idled under the cover of darkness. Men moved in and out of an old warehouse, their weapons glinting faintly. Raul knelt beside him, his camera bag slung over one shoulder. "That's one of their supply depots," he whispered. "They move people, drugs, and weapons through there. If your daughter's alive, someone here knows where." Jake's eyes never left the warehouse. "How many guards?" "Too many," Raul muttered grimly. "You're not going to like this." Jake glanced at him, his expression hard. "I didn't come here to like anything." Raul sighed, pulling a crumpled map from his bag. "There's a side entrance on the north side, unlocked most nights. It's used to bring in workers. We can get in and out fast." Jake stared at the map, his mind working. "We?" Raul snorted. "You think I'm letting you storm in alone? I've seen what happens to men who go in blind." Jake didn't argue. Deep down, he knew Raul was right. This was no time for heroics, only action. The plan was simple: slip in, grab intel, and get out. Yet simplicity rarely survived the chaos of reality. Jake moved like a shadow, his boots silent against the dirt as they approached the warehouse's northern side. Raul followed close behind, his camera tucked away, his movement surprisingly quiet for a journalist. The door was just as Raul said, unlocked, its hinges groaning softly as Jake pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with gasoline and sweat. Crates stacked to the ceiling formed tight corridors, and faint voices echoed from deeper within. Jake's grip on his pistol tightened as he moved forward, his body tense with focus. Raul pointed silently toward a small office on the far end of the warehouse, its single window glowing dimly. There, that's where they keep the records. Jake nodded, slipping through the narrow paths between crates, every step a deliberate calculation. As they reached the office door, Raul whispered, "I'll watch the hall. Be quick." Jake eased the door open, slipping inside. The room reeked of cigar smoke and papers littered the desk. Jake rifled through the stacks, his eyes scanning for anything useful. Names, routes, shipments. It was all there. Then he saw it, a logbook with Emma's name scrawled in a ledger. He froze, his pulse pounding. "Prisionera, Ranchos de Cielo." His breath hitched. The ranch Raul mentioned earlier. It wasn't a rumor. Emma was alive. Suddenly, shouting erupted outside. "Intrusos! Intrusos!" Jake spun, yanking the door open just as gunfire exploded across the warehouse. Raul ducked behind a crate, shouting, "Run!" Jake bolted through the chaos, dodging the spray of bullets as the cartel's men scrambled to surround them. He fired back, 2 shots, center mass. One man dropped, the other fell screaming. Splinters rained down as crates exploded under the barrage. "Out the side!" Raul yelled, his voice hoarse. Jake sprinted, adrenaline driving him as gunfire cracked behind them. They burst through the side entrance into the open air, but the safety of the night was short-lived. Tires screeched as a pickup truck roared around the corner, headlights blinding. "Move!" Raul shoved Jake toward the shadows. The truck's door flew open, men spilling out with guns drawn. Jake fired again, short, controlled bursts, hitting one man in the shoulder before dragging Raul behind an abandoned water tank. "You get what you needed?" Raul shouted over the chaos. Jake nodded, teeth gritted. "She's alive. They've got her at a ranch." Raul's eyes widened. "Then we need to go, now." They darted into the darkness, slipping through alleys as the cartel scrambled to track them. Engines growled and searchlights swept over the streets, but Jake and Raul moved fast, disappearing into the maze of back roads. By the time they reached the edge of town, the night was silent again, save for their ragged breathing. Jake leaned against a brick wall, sweat pouring down his face. Raul dropped beside him, clutching his camera bag like it was his lifeline. "You're insane," Raul panted, shaking his head. "But you got your lead." Jake stared at the stars above, his chest heaving. "I'm coming for her." Raul glanced at him, his face grim but resolved. "Then you'd better be ready for war, amigo, because after tonight, they'll know you're here." Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't care who knew. Emma was out there and nothing, no cartel, no army, no devil himself was going to stop him. The room was small, damp, and suffocating. Pale light filtered through a narrow window high on the wall, casting faint stripes across the cracked concrete floor. Emma Turner sat with her back against the wall, her wrists raw from the ropes that bound her hands. The air smelled of mold and gasoline, a sickening combination that made her stomach churn. She focused on the details, the noises outside, the footsteps, anything to distract herself from the dread clawing at her chest. 2 days, maybe 3? She'd lost track of time. The heavy steel door creaked open, and Emma's pulse quickened. A man stepped inside, a burly figure with thick arms and a face hidden behind a black bandana. Miguel Alarcón. She knew his name now, whispered in fear by the other captives. He was the leader here, his voice calm but sharp like a knife. "You're quiet today," Miguel said in flawless English, crouching in front of her. "Are you finally understanding your situation?" Emma lifted her chin slightly, fighting to meet his gaze without flinching. "What do you want from me?" Miguel's dark eyes glinted with amusement. "Nothing you can give. You are a message. A reminder to your people that they don't belong here." He stood, pacing the small room. "But you're clever, I see that." Emma's eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me." Miguel chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "I know more than you think. I know you've been watching, listening. You think you're smarter than the others. Emma stayed silent, her heart pounding. He stopped and leaned close, his voice dropping. Keep your eyes open all you want, little girl. It won't save you. With that, he turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Emma couldn't tell. The muffled sounds of trucks and shouting echoed from outside the walls. She closed her eyes and exhaled, steadying herself. She had one advantage. They underestimated her. She wasn't just a scared girl. Her father had taught her how to stay calm under pressure, how to observe and how to think. She'd been doing exactly that. The guards were sloppy. They rotated at irregular times, and one of them, a wiry man who couldn't be much older than 20, had started lingering near the door when he brought her food. He avoided looking directly at her, his hands shaking slightly when he placed the plate down. He's nervous. That was something she could use. The next time the wiry guard entered, Emma spoke. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. You don't want to be here, do you? The guard froze, looking at her with startled eyes. Shut up, he muttered, though his voice wavered. You're scared, she pressed gently. They're scared of him too. He swallowed hard, but Emma could see the conflict in his expression. He lingered a moment too long before turning abruptly and slamming the door. It wasn't much, but it was something. Emma sat back against the wall, her mind racing. She didn't know if her father would come, but she couldn't afford to wait. If she wanted to survive, she needed to find allies, or at least plant doubt where she could. The sound of distant engines rumbled through the compound, growing louder. Emma's fingers curled into fists. Something was happening out there. She just had to stay ready. The glow of lanterns and floodlights bathed the cartel compound in an eerie haze. Trucks came and went in the night, their cargo unseen, but Jake knew what this place represented. Money, weapons, and lives traded like currency. Raoul and Jake crouched in the brush beyond the compound's perimeter, obscured by darkness. You're insane, Raoul muttered, peering through a pair of battered binoculars. You can't just walk in there. Jake tightened his grip on the canvas bag slung across his back. Inside, he carried tools of deception, fake documents, a stash of weapons, and just enough confidence to sell his act. We don't have time to sit and wait. Raoul lowered the binoculars, his jaw tight. You're walking into a lion's den. You understand that, right? Miguel Alarcon doesn't deal in mercy. Jake's expression hardened. Neither do I. Minutes later, Jake stood at the compound's gate, the heat of the desert clinging to his skin. He wore a stained leather jacket and a hat pulled low, his posture rigid yet deliberate, like a man who belonged there. Two guards stepped forward, their rifles slung across their chests. One of them barked a question in Spanish, suspicion thick in his tone. Jake answered in a calm, clipped voice, his Spanish rough but convincing. I'm here to speak with Miguel Alarcon. I bring merchandise. The guards exchanged a glance. Who sent you? Jake reached into his jacket and handed over a forged letter bearing the mark of a rival arms dealer Raoul had told him about. They told me Alarcon pays well. The guard studied the letter before muttering into a radio. Tension crackled in the air as Jake held his ground. Finally, the gates creaked open. One step closer, Jake thought, keeping his breathing steady. Inside the compound, it was worse than Jake had imagined. The stench of oil and sweat mixed with the sounds of shouting and laughter. Men lounged with rifles across their laps, their eyes darting toward him as he passed. His skin crawled, but he forced himself to move with the arrogance they expected. Miguel Alarcon sat at a makeshift table under a large canvas tent, surrounded by his men. He was smaller than Jake expected, his presence amplified not by size but by an air of cold calculation. A gold-plated pistol sat on the table beside him. Miguel's sharp eyes settled on Jake as he approached. And who are you? Jake set the canvas bag down with a dull thud. Someone who knows what you need. He unzipped it slowly, revealing carefully arranged firearms. AR-15S clean, American, you don't see these every day. Miguel leaned forward, studying the weapons with feigned disinterest. And why are you here? To do business, Jake replied, his voice steady despite the thundering in his chest. I hear you pay well for quality. Miguel smirked, his gaze never leaving Jake's. And what makes you think I trust you? Jake met his gaze head on. Because I'm desperate enough to come here. That's the kind of man you can use. Miguel's smile faded. Silence stretched between them, suffocating and endless. Then he nodded, gesturing to one of his men. Search him. Jake braced as rough hands patted him down. They found nothing but a knife and a roll of cash, exactly as planned. Let him stay, Miguel said, waving his hand dismissively. We'll talk more soon. Jake exhaled subtly, keeping his face blank as he stepped back. His cover was holding, for now. While Jake played his role, Raul worked in the shadows. Hidden in the underbrush near the compound, he watched the guards' movements, sketching a mental map of their patrols. His hands shook slightly as he scribbled notes. He whispered to himself, "Come on, Jake, don't blow it." A sudden commotion broke Raul's focus. Shouts from the far side of the compound. He glimpsed a group of guards moving toward one of the trucks, weapons raised. Something was happening. Raul's gut twisted. Jake's distraction was working, but the clock was ticking. Inside the tent, Miguel rose to his feet, speaking to one of his lieutenants in rapid Spanish. Jake caught fragments of the conversation. Shipment, hostages, secure the ranch. His blood ran cold at the mention of the ranch. Emma, he needed more time. You need another shipment? Jake interjected, forcing Miguel's attention back to him. I can get you more. Miguel's eyes narrowed. You're bold, gringo. Too bold. Jake forced a smirk. Bold enough to find you. Miguel's laughter echoed, but Jake saw the suspicion lingering in his gaze. He was playing a dangerous game, and Miguel was no fool. Outside, Raul whispered into his radio. You've got minutes before they figure you out, Jake. Get the hell out of there. Jake, still standing in front of Miguel, gritted his teeth and muttered back under his breath, not without Emma. The air inside the compound was thick with tension. Jake stood at the far end of the tent, hands steady as he watched Miguel's men move in and out, their eyes constantly on him. Every second he spent here was a risk, but the information he'd gathered was too valuable to waste. Raul's voice crackled through the earpiece. Jake, they're planning something big. There's a convoy leaving tonight. It's your shot to get Emma. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Where? South, toward the ranch. They're moving her there for transfer, Raul replied urgently. It's now or never. Jake's pulse quickened. He glanced at Miguel, who was engaged in a conversation with a lieutenant. The distraction was his moment. He spoke low into the mic. I'm going in. Raul's response was immediate. It's too dangerous. If they catch you... I don't have a choice, Jake interrupted. I'm not leaving without her. Jake moved quickly, sliding through the shadows, weaving between the guards who were busy with their own tasks. His steps were calculated, his breath slow and controlled. The ranch, Emma's location, was closer now, but it was still a dangerous distance away. Every part of him screamed to wait, to gather more intel, but he couldn't risk it. This was the only chance he had. As Jake approached the compound's exit, the sounds of an approaching convoy echoed in the distance. His time had run out. Jake's heart pounded as he slid through the gates, knowing that the moment he stepped into the open, the entire cartel would be hunting him. There was no turning back now. The night was pitch black, the silence broken only by the distant hum of engines. Jake crouched low in the brush, his eyes locked on the ranch ahead. The convoy had arrived, its trucks unloading with mechanical precision. He could see figures moving in and out of the compound, their shadows stretching long under the weak light of flood lamps. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to focus. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. He had one shot at this. Raul's voice crackled in his earpiece. Jake, you're in the clear. I've created the distraction. Go. Jake nodded, though he knew Raul couldn't see him. He didn't waste a second. He slipped past the outer guards, moving fast and low, keeping his body pressed to the shadows. Every step was a calculated risk, but Emma was close. The thought of her kept him moving. Inside the compound, the chaos of the cartel's operations played out in real time. Men shouted, loading supplies and weapons into trucks. Jake's breath quickened as he neared the central building, the last place he'd seen Emma. He paused just outside the door. Two guards stood in front, speaking in low voices. Jake's pulse raced. He had no time to wait for them to leave. He made his move. In a blur of motion, Jake tackled one of the men to the ground, using the element of surprise. The other guard reached for his gun, but Jake was faster. A swift, silent strike sent him sprawling. The door creaked open. Inside, Emma's face lit up in surprise and relief as she saw her father standing in the doorway. Dad, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake didn't hesitate. We're getting out of here, now. The escape was chaotic, a blur of sharp turns and adrenaline. Jake kept his arm around Emma as they sprinted through the compound, the sounds of shouting and gunfire filling the air behind them. The moment the guards realized they'd been infiltrated, all hell broke loose. "Faster!" Jake shouted, pushing Emma ahead of him. She stumbled but kept going, her face pale with fear. Raul's voice came through the earpiece, frantic. "Jake, they're on your tail! There's no time! Get to the truck!" Jake barely processed the words. The truck, their only chance of getting out alive. They reached the fence, the metal groaning as they scrambled over it, their breaths coming in desperate gasps. The world outside the compound was dark and empty, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They ran for the truck Raul had secured, parked at the edge of the property. The engine roared to life as they climbed in, but before Jake could slam the door shut, a burst of gunfire shattered the night. Emma cried out in pain as a bullet grazed her shoulder, the wound shallow but enough to make her stumble. "No!" Jake shouted, pulling her into the truck. "Hold on!" The truck lurched forward, tires screeching as they sped off into the night. In the rearview mirror, the compound was already a blur of lights and chaos. The cartel would be hunting them soon. Jake's chest tightened as he glanced at Emma, her face pale and her breathing shallow. He reached for the first aid kit, but the weight of their situation settled heavily on him. They were running out of time. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: there was no going back now. The abandoned factory loomed in the distance, its crumbling walls like a graveyard for the past. Jake's heart raced as he drove toward it, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavily on his chest. Emma sat beside him, her face pale, but her eyes fierce with determination. Raul's truck was parked nearby, the engine running as he leaned against it, waiting. Jake pulled up, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "This is it," he said, voice tight. Raul nodded, grim. "We make our stand here." Inside the factory, Miguel Alarcon and his men were waiting. Jake could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The time for running was over. "Stay close," Jake told Emma. She nodded, gripping the gun he'd handed her for the first time. They moved toward the entrance, guns raised, every step echoing in the silence. As they entered the darkened factory, the sound of boots on concrete sent a chill down Jake's spine. A voice called from the shadows. "You came all this way for nothing." Miguel stepped into the light, his smirk cold and confident. "This ends now." The battle was swift and brutal. Gunfire rang out, ricocheting off metal as Jake fought his way toward Miguel. With one final desperate move, Jake lunged, tackling Miguel to the ground. They struggled, each blow fueled by desperation and rage, until Jake's hands found Miguel's throat. With a final squeeze, it was over. Jake stood, panting as the dust settled. He had won, but at what cost? In the end, Cruzando a Linea reminds us that love pushes us beyond our limits. Jake's relentless fight to save his daughter proves that when everything seems lost, our determination and courage can still shine through the darkest moments. But what about you? What would you have done in his place? Would you risk it all, stepping into enemy territory, knowing the odds were against you? Click on the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-reflection and explore other gripping stories that challenge our morals and instincts. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more tales that inspire,